Hello, New York Giants fans, and welcome to a new edition of the Valentine's Views podcast here on YouTube. Please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Thought we would do a couple of things today. As you might expect, lots and lots of draft-related questions coming into the Big Blue View mailbag. So I'll give you guys answers to a few of those, in addition to the regular Big Blue View mailbag that will publish on Saturday morning at bigblueview.com. Also, a little bit later on in the show, we will talk to Johnston of SB Nation's Nebraska website, Corn Nation, and we will be talking a little bit about New York Giants' 7th round pick, tight end Thomas Fidone out of Nebraska. John will give us some insight into the kind of player he thinks Fidone is and the kind of career that he thinks and hopes that Fidone might be able to have. So a couple of things for you today. So let's get to some of the mailbag questions first. Jim Sackman wrote in and he wants to know about all of the resources that the Giants put into the defensive line and the edge group in the draft. He says, granted, we haven't seen the rookies play, but the Giants have 4 high-priced players in the defensive front 7 in Kayvon Thibodeau, Dexter Lawrence, Brian Burns, and Bobby Okereke. Obviously, they added Abdul Carter with the 3rd overall pick, defensive tackle Darius Alexander in the 3rd round, and they signed a free agent Chauncey Golston to a fairly healthy 3-year contract. And Jim wants to know if that implies that rotation and depth is the path forward. Or if one of the edge type players might see some time at linebacker. Listen, Jim, it's entirely possible that, for example, Abdul Carter, to get him on the field as often as possible along with Kayvon Thibodeau and Brian Burns, it's entirely possible that Abdul Carter sees some time at off-ball linebacker. He played that position at Penn State until this past year, and obviously has some skill there, has some ability there. If you remember Micah Parsons, the player that Carter's often compared to, Micah Parsons was actually an off-ball linebacker at Penn State. Didn't convert full-time to the edge until he got to Dallas, where I thought edge would be Parsons' best position, and that turned out to be the case. So look, it's entirely possible that a guy like Carter, at least initially, sees a little bit of time, playing off ball, just to get him some additional snaps. But in terms of the depth, look, this is something that the Giants have been hoping to create, have been trying to create for years and years. They had that at one time back in the day with Justin Tuck, O.C. Umenyiora, Michael Strahan, Matthias Kiwanuka. They had that, with multiple pass rushers throughout the years, with quality linebackers who weren't able to get on the field a whole lot. And depth is something, Jerry Reese used to talk about it. Dave Gettleman used to talk about trying to build a deep defensive line rotation where guys could rotate in and out. It hasn't happened for the Giants for a long time. And on paper, Joe Schoen has finally created that. Chauncey Golston can play with his hand in the ground. He can also play standing up. The Giants added a couple of solid, if not, unspectacular, but solid, capable defensive tackles in free agency in Roy Robertson Harris and Jeremiah Ledbetter. You've got Golston now. You've got Darius Alexander now. Raheem Nunez Roches is still on the roster. Elijah Chapman was impressive as a rookie. So you have 6 or 7 players you can rotate on the defensive line with guys with their hands in the ground. You have 3 players in Thibodeau, Burns, and Carter you can rotate. And if you remember, Kayvon Thibodeau missed 5 games last year with an injury. Brian Burns spent a lot of time on the field playing at less than 100% with a variety of different leg injuries. So depth is critical. And I think you have no farther to look than the Philadelphia Eagles. Philadelphia has, for the last few years, they send waves and waves of front 7 guys at opposing offenses. It's not about one guy. It's not just Dexter Lawrence and a bunch of guys you've never heard of. It's not just Jalen Carter for the Eagles and a bunch of guys you never heard of. They continue to draft front 7 players. The reality of it is, offensive and defensive line, you need more players than any other position on the football field. You have to continue adding to those positions. You still win and lose games in the trenches in the NFL. And when you, on the defensive side of the ball, can send waves of defensive linemen and edge defenders at the offensive line, when your guys are always fresh, that's an advantage. And that is what the Giants are trying to create. Look at what the Eagles did even this year, even with all of the players that they have on the defensive front 7. They used their first round pick on Jahad Campbell out of Alabama, another edge guy, linebacker guy who maybe fell in the draft a little bit, but he adds yet another outstanding player to that front 7. Later in the draft, they added Nebraska defensive tackle Ty Robinson in the 4th round. That's a guy that I loved watching on film, guy that will add energy and power and playmaking to their front 7. So, and even later in the draft, at the end of the draft, they drafted Antoine Powell Ryland, another edge defender in the 6th round out of Virginia Tech. So they continue to stockpile in their front 7. Smail Mondin Jr. out of Georgia was a 5th round pick for the Eagles. So they continue to try to make certain that their front 7 is always deeper and better than the opposing offensive line that they're going to be facing. And that's a good philosophy and a good example for the Giants to follow. And it seems like they are finally beginning to build that kind of rotation that they wanted. All right, let's get to another question. Greg Hart wants to know about the Giants draft. He says everybody's giving the Giants high marks for the draft, but that and he wants to know if I think the skill gap between the Giants and the division rivals is closing. And then he also wants to know if he thinks the Giants are finally getting the depth that they need for a long NFL season. Greg, look, I did the depth chart the other day at Big Blue View, and you can go back and look at that on the website. But the depth chart shows that there aren't as many holes on this roster as there used to be. There are, on the defensive line that we just talked about, on the edge that we just talked about, on the offensive line where Joe Shane drafted Marcus Bowe in the 5th round, and he added 2 players who could be swing tackles, guys who both have swing tackle experience in the NFL, James Hudson III and Stone Forsythe. I'm not sure both guys will make the team, but the Giants will have an actual experienced swing tackle. They have some depth at most spots all across the roster now. There are guys that you can look at and say, "Oh, that won't be a huge problem if he has to play." They have, even on the offensive line, they still have Greg Van Roten. They have Aaron Stinney. Maybe Evan Neal turns into a quality guard. We'll have to see how that goes. But there is more depth along the roster at various places than there used to be. Are they closing the gap on the Eagles and the Commanders and even the Cowboys? I think time will tell on that. Look, the Eagles have a tremendous roster. The Eagles added several quality players in the draft. The Commanders draft has been well received. So I don't know if they're closing the gap. I feel like their roster is getting better. I feel like that gives them a better opportunity. They should get better quarterback play this year with Russell Wilson, maybe with Jameis Winston, if Jackson Dart gets to play at the end of the year. But specifically with Wilson, they should have better quarterback play than they've had in the past couple of years. They should be better. They should have a better opportunity to win some of these close games. We'll see how they measure up against the Eagles, against the Cowboys, against the Commanders, against some of the better teams in the league. The schedule isn't easy, and I think the answer to that question, to whether they've closed the gap, is going to come on the field this fall. All right, we'll do one more question before we get to my interview with John Johnston from Corn Nation. Douglas Firth wants to know, in regards to the Giants quarterback situation. A couple of years ago, Giants co-owner John Mara said in reference to Daniel Jones that we've done everything possible to mess the kid up. And Doug wants to know if, with the situation the Giants are in with Brian Daboll and perhaps Joe Schoen on the hot seat entering 2025, if Mara and the Giants are repeating that mistake by not extending the GM and head coach at this point for another year. Doug, I think it's a valid concern that the Giants will put Jackson Dart in that sort of head coach, GM sort of spin cycle, the way that Daniel Jones was. A little bit of, a year with Pat Shurmur, and then he had Joe Judge and Jason Garrett, and then Judge gets fired, and he's got Brian Daboll now and Mike Kafka and so many offensive coordinators, so many head coaches, 2 GMs. None of that is good for the development of a young quarterback. Caleb Williams is going through that in Chicago now with the coach who was involved in his being drafted already having been fired. A lot of young quarterbacks have been ruined and or at least negatively impacted by the situations that they've been put into, by the turbulence around them, by coaching changes, by offensive coordinator changes. I don't think it's time to look at that and say that the Giants have already made a mistake. We will have to see what happens in 2025. I don't think you can give Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen an extension now, not off the 2 years that the Giants have just had, not off 6-11 and then 3-14, with a lot of personnel mistakes made, with a lot of kind of questionable things that have happened. 9-25 over the last 2 years. I don't think you can extend those guys right now. I do think the Giants are in a situation where they have to wait and see. But you cross your fingers that things go well enough in 2025 that the Giants are able to keep Jackson Dart out of that spin cycle. that Brian Daboll, who is the coach who banged the table for Jackson Dart, there's some belief out there that, at least initially, with all of the time that the Giants spent looking at attending practices, going to games, doing all of that work, there's some belief that the Giants front office, Joe Shane, was interested in Shedeur Sanders as his primary target. There's some belief that it was once the coaching staff got involved, that once Brian Daboll, who really is the guy that the Giants organization looks at as the quarterback expert, once Daboll got involved and really studied these guys and got to know these guys, that Jackson Dart was Daboll's target, Daboll's guy, and the Giants went and got Jackson Dart. So I think that we hope that the Giants do well enough in 2025 that Daboll gets at least another year to work with Jackson Dart, to get Dart on the field, to really begin to see the fruits of the labor that the Giants are going to put into Dart over the next year. So that would be the ideal situation. But I don't think that you can legitimately extend the head coach and the GM at this point, coming off of the last 2 years. We just cross our fingers. We hope that it works out. We hope that the Giants are able to provide consistency and stability for Jackson Dart. But the 2025 season and how things go is going to have a lot to do with that. All right, let's turn away from the mailbag questions now, and let's play for you the interview that I did with John Johnston of Corn Nation regarding the Giants' 7th round pick, Nebraska tight end Thomas Fidone. As we continue to try to get to know some of the young men that the New York Giants selected in the 2025 NFL draft, I'm joined today by John Johnston of SB Nation's Corn Nation, which covers the Nebraska Cornhuskers. And we are going to talk about 7th round pick, tight end out of Nebraska, Thomas Fidone, who I just found out it's not pronounced Fidone. Just found that out. Thank goodness.
Well, now I'm confused. Maybe it is.
Thomas Fidone. So just, John, welcome to the show, and thank you for a few minutes. Appreciate that.
Sure.
You, just in talking about Thomas Fidone, we'll go that way. And we'll probably and I'll probably mess it up along the way, but
I'm sure people will tell us if we're wrong.
There you go. Did the folks at Corn Nation, did you guys expect him to be drafted?
Ooh. I did. I kind of thought that, he's got the size. He's got what you want in a tight end to play in the NFL. The two, if you know anything about him, you know that he started his career at Nebraska. He was one of the most recruited. Well, he was the most recruited tight end in the nation. Came to Nebraska, and the first thing he did was tear his ACL. And then he rehabbed, missed a year, rehabbed, and then he tore his ACL again. So he missed 2 years in a row. And I guess I thought because of that, maybe the NFL teams would take a pass on him. But I think, in the 7th round, again, he's got all the physical characteristics. Why not take a chance on him? Because I think his best football is in front of him. It's not behind him. Because, wow. Well, do you want me to go ask me another question before I go into this long soliloquy about Nebraska football?
No, you go right ahead. You're on a roll. You just go right ahead.
I think his time in Nebraska is one of the worst times for Nebraska football in our history. Scott Frost, a lot of people, well, number one, he turned out to be the worst coach in Nebraska football history. Number two, there's this attitude amongst a lot of people that he was a good offensive coordinator, and he wasn't. At Nebraska, it was like he had a call sheet, and he just randomly picked things. His offense wasn't good, and he's fired. Matt Rule comes in. Matt Rule brings in Marcus Satterfield as an offensive coordinator, and Marcus Satterfield. Well, put it this way: last year on our bye week in 2024, I did a YouTube video, like I think it was called like 5 reasons Marcus Satterfield should be fired, and he was fired as the offensive coordinator during our bye week because he was terrible. And I think the point relative to Fidone is that this guy lived through coaches at Nebraska as offensive coordinators, I think, that never knew what to do with him because they didn't know what to do with an offense. Frost should have known better. He's been around for a while. But I think both of them, when you look at an offense, all right, you look at it, what do we start with? We have something that's a base plays or base formation or base something. And neither of those offensive coordinators seemed to do anything like that. They didn't have butter plays. They didn't, have any kind of plays where they could feature Fidone. I think, and he's what, 6'6", 240 pounds or something. I mean, he's a, big talented guy.
Right.
And you would have thought that he'd had some production this year. And again, but what happened was Nebraska fired Marcus Satterfield and brought in Dana Holgerson as offensive coordinator. And if you know anything about Dana Holgerson, he's been around for a long time. And I think that, if Fidone could have stayed another year, but he just, I think he saw the writing on the wall. I think Nebraska's rosters have like 89 receivers on it.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to probably throw the ball to receivers a lot. And where was the tight end going to fit in and all that? I'm sure they are. They always say that, but
Right.
what was going to be his role? And there
Right.
was a lot of guys coming up. So I'm glad he got drafted. I'll say this: he's going to be the next Gronk. How's that?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
You know what? Because I just think that a guy. I think we're both old and crusty, right? I mean, think about it. When you were 18 years old and you were going to go play football, let's say for a university, you tear your ACL and you sit out a year and you go, okay, I'm ready to try again. The first thing you do is tear an ACL. I mean, at that point, I'm like drinking beer and trying to find women that'll feel sorry for me. That's what my next step would be. You know what I mean? And this guy
Right.
had the tenacity to fight through all that stuff and earn a starting roster spot and produce. And I
Right.
just look at a guy like that, and I think, because of that tenacity, I think that he'll be successful in the NFL. And I really do. I'm rooting for him. I think his best football is still ahead of him. I think that I don't know much about the New York Giants, except you seem to always have quarterback problems. But well, who doesn't in the NFL? Except
Right.
for 5 or 6 teams. But I hope that he has a bunch of coaches that know what they're doing and can use him to the best of his abilities and can coach him up. I don't think our coaching staff in Nebraska is horrible. I just think the coordination was just non-existent. The Frost era was terrible. It was just a
Right.
mess. But under
So
Rule, I think we're doing better.
when you look at this kid, the torn ACL twice, same knee, it was his left knee. And when you look at pictures of the kid, you can clearly see that he wears the brace on the left knee. Um, it might be hard to tell because you didn't see him for 2 years, but is the impression that those back-to-back ACL tears took something away from him athletically? I mean, his testing numbers are really good.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if there is something that maybe was taken away from him, but with the 2 injuries.
Well, I think you'll see people out there say, "Well, he lost a step, or he's not as explosive." Well, how the hell would they know? We never got to see him really without ripped up knees. So I think that's a little bit of a you're making an assumption. I think it's pretty good. Well, put it this way: it's not just assumption; it's projection. Again, going back to if I tore my ACL twice, you'd have to lose something. But I think even with losing something, I still think he's an amazing athletic, tight end that can, again, his best football's ahead of him.
Right, I'm looking at his spider chart from Mock Draftable,
Oh my
and
God, you guys use those, and I look at them, and all I
he's
see is like serial killers or something.
he's a little bit undersized, 243, but this with with two torn ACLs, he's 68th percentile in 20-yard shuttle, 78th in the three cone,
Yeah,
94th in the broad jump, 65th percentile in the 40-yard dash, 87th in the 10-yard split. So there's a ton of athleticism there.
yeah, yeah. I
Um
don't think you can spend your time saying what would he be like without that. I think he's still got a lot in him. You know.
mhm. What is the skill set? How do as is he inline? Is he, more of an outside guy? Is he, a multiple guy? What is the skill set, and how do you think he should be used?
Ooh, you're going to ask me about NFL offenses. How should he be used? I think that he can. I think he's a decent blocker. I think there's people that would say he's probably a pretty good blocker. I just say decent. I think that
Mhm.
those skills can be, uh, made better with coaching. But in the NFL, I don't pay attention to NFL offenses enough to know the answer to that question. To be honest with you, I would have liked to seen us use him honestly more downfield.
Mhm.
As the guy, I think we used him in some middle screens, like tight end screens over the middle. I loved those plays. I don't
Mhm.
think they ran him enough. I think he could have been very good at those, or produced a lot more than he did.
Mhm.
Uh, I don't think you put him outside though. I
No.
just I think you line him up as a traditional tight end and let him be tight endy.
Well, that works. That
Yeah,
still works in the NFL.
yeah.
Um, what, if anything, I don't know, how much you guys know about these kids off the field. But what, if anything, can you tell us, about the kind of kid that the Giants are getting?
Well, I mentioned Gronk for a reason. It wasn't just the on the field stuff. I mean, Gronk has kind of got a personality that leaps out at people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think Thomas Fidone has a personality in there too. It's not a I He shushed the crowd one time after he scored a touchdown, and Nebraska fans didn't like it. And a lot of them, I don't know. We are so fickle as fans. I mean, all of us as football fans. If a player does something off the cuff, we how it's taken is bizarre. But I do think he's got a lot of personality. He's certainly got a lot of tattoos. Uh, I think it's. I think he can be fun in the NFL. I think also the personality side of him. But running the coordination, I've run it for almost 20 years now. You hear so much stuff on the inside that you don't, you know, tell anybody. You
Right.
don't report, and
Right.
I never heard anything negative about him. You'd hear about guys drinking or getting in trouble and stuff. I'd never heard anything negative about him.
No,
You
college
know,
kids never do that stuff.
yeah,
Yeah. Um, so obviously, you said you think, obviously you compare him to Gronk. You think he's got a terrific, future ahead of him. Um, is he a kid you think needs a little bit of time,
yeah.
or is he a kid that can step in quickly?
I don't think he's going to step in quickly just because. Well, number one, maybe he'll be shocked and having an offense that knows what they're doing. He'll just go,
Mhm.
huh, what? But okay, that's terrible. Uh, I think it'll take him time to adjust to the NFL and see what is expected to him. I think it'll be just completely different than college. I don't think he's a guy that's going to walk up right away and be a
Mhm.
first year starter. I hope I'm wrong about that. I really do. I hope that he has a really glorious NFL career because again, it goes back to it's that put you guys in the NFL have always what you live with is players arguing about contracts and getting paid and all this stuff. Us in college are now just having all the romanticism ripped out of our sport. and it's all going to be about the money now. And it's tough to take, especially if you're an old crusty guy like me, you know. And I look at Thomas Fidone, and he's kind of a rag to riches guy. You know, the tenacity of the fighter, the guy who shouldn't be able to do this, but yet he's being able to do this. You know,
because because of the injuries.
yeah,
Right.
and you know, we had other players. Nobody nobody drafted Nash Hutmacher out of Nebraska, defensive lineman that I thought was for sure would get drafted. And you know, that Fidone got drafted,
Mm-hmm.
and I have a problem with Hutmacher's name because I always called him Nutmash. When you have to be serious about these things, I usually am not very serious, if you can tell when I'm doing my Corn Nation videos and stuff like that. But you know, the underdog story for Fidone, I think it's a great story, and I just for that reason, and plus I liked watching him play.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you know, tight ends in Nebraska. This is going to go back a long time. My favorite tight end in Nebraska is Johnny Mitchell. This is like 1992, and he left for the NFL early, and it broke my heart because he was so
Mm-hmm.
beautiful to watch. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and in a time where we mostly ran the ball,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, when Fidone missed a block, I was swearing at him loudly. And when he made plays, I was swearing at him loudly, but in, you know, kind of in the different direction without anger.
Oh, all right. Well, we will be looking forward to seeing what becomes of Thomas Fidone's NFL career, and I'll be looking forward to checking out some of those tattoos this spring,
Yeah.
and see what's up with all of that. But John, I appreciate the time. I know. Why don't you plug where people can find some of your work, your Corn Nation and other places before I let you go?
Well, we're at cornnation.com for SB Nation Nebraska football, Corn Nation on YouTube for, you know, Nebraska football. And then I do have one other YouTube channel that is Hardcore College Football History. So, if you ever wondered, like, if the football started in 1869 and it took until 1912 for it to become, quote, modern football, unquote, if you want that history or the history of the wishbone, this off season I'm doing history of offenses. So, history of the wishbone was just published a little while back. Next up will be the veer, and I'll
Mm-hmm.
do the I formation, and then I'll start getting into the Notre Dame box. Have you ever heard that?
Nice, nice.
But
All of that.
let me ask you this: have you ever wondered why the offense in football has to come set for a full second? Not just come set, but set for a full second.
Sure.
Well, that's the kind of stuff I'm trying to cover in the History Channel because I
Mm-hmm.
think football history for a lot of YouTube and a lot of stuff has become biggest players, biggest names, and we
Mm-hmm.
forgot about how did football evolve throughout the years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, butt
Nice.
blocking was a thing in the 1970s.
Not Mark Sanchez didn't invent it.
Yeah, no, you can watch the Wishbone video to find out what butt blocking is. So there you go.
Wow. All right. Hey, John, I appreciate it, folks. Check out John's YouTube channel. Check out Corn Nation if you're interested in Nebraska football. And as I said, we'll be looking forward to getting a chance to meet Thomas Fidone this spring and follow his NFL career. So thanks again, John. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Oh. Giants fans, that's our show for today. Hope that you enjoyed the interview with John Johnston about Thomas Fidone. Hope that you found my answers to the mailbag questions to be at least somewhat enlightening, at least somewhat informed. So and stay tuned for the Saturday morning written version of the mailbag and all of the post draft and preseason coverage of your New York Giants that we are continuing to churn out at bigblueview.com. As always, Giants fans, thank you for watching. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.